Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's great to be here with you all. Wonderful to be here with this Lunch and Learn series. I want to thank the United Synagogue for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I am Rabbi Joel Kenigsberg from Magen Avot, coming to you live from Hendon. So today we're going to be learning together, delving a little bit into the Parasha. And I'm going to be doing something slightly different. We'll be starting off with the Parasha, but we'll be going on a journey that's going to take us into one of the most fascinating questions, something that stands really at the cutting edge of both science and halakha, and science and religion today in the world. So if we just have a look at the sources, starting from our parasha, the shir is called "Keeping Kosher and Meeting the Future," and let's see where we get. So first of all, starting off in our parasha this week, Parashat Shemini, it tells us about the laws of what makes an animal kosher. We have lists. We go through animals, we go through birds, and we go through fish as well. But just looking here at a few of the psukim we've got here in Hebrew together with the translation. At the beginning of Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11, Parashat Shemini, the Torah tells us, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'Aaron lemar lehem." Hashem spoke to Moshe and Aaron, telling them, what are the signs? What are the signs that you need for an animal, whether it's going to be kosher, that which you can eat and that which you can't eat? It says, "Dabru el bnei Yisrael lemor zot hachaya asher tochlu mikol ha'behema shel haaretz." These are the signs when it comes to land animals. These are the things that you can eat. And the two signs which the Torah tells us in Pasuk Gimel, those animals which have got, in this translation, come across as true hooves, but it's split hooves. Any animals that chew the cud, those are the two signs that we know. Those are the things that make a land animal kosher. And the Torah goes through, it gives us a few examples of animals, some which have maybe one of those signs and not the other one, some which have neither of those signs. Those will not be kosher. It's only those which will have both. And as I said, it goes through afterwards. The Torah goes into sea creatures, it goes into fowl as well. It's a specific list. We're not going to be discussing those today. But it's all relatively straightforward. And the truth is that for hundreds of years, it was relatively straightforward to know which animals are kosher, which are not. Of course, the laws in terms of shechita and what needs to be done in order to make the animal kosher, to make the meat kosher for consumption, maybe get a little bit more complex. Which animals we could eat and which animals we couldn't, for the most part of history, we've known, and it's been pretty simple. And this is where our journey begins. We fast forward a few thousand years. We're now in 2021, but if we go back 8 years, 2000 to 2013, we have a new invention in the world. We have something which comes up where for the first time, maybe we could have meat. Maybe we could have an animal that actually doesn't fit into any of these categories. Maybe we have meat that doesn't come from an animal at all. And what are we going to say? Is it going to be kosher? Is it not going to be kosher? Is there something that the Torah wants us to be involved in? Is there something which the Torah wants us to encourage, to eat, to not to eat, to stay away from? We'll be talking a little bit, and this is what's called today cultured meat, lab-grown meat, has a few different names. And you can see these pictures in front of you. There's a hamburger and a steak. This is Lunch and Learn. These, on the left-hand side, what you'll see is this hamburger. This is how it looked when it was raw, and this is how it looked when it was cooked. On the right, that was produced in 2013. You see on the right is a steak, which is a little bit more recent. Both of these are not meat that was produced maybe in the conventional way. Perhaps in 20 years, in 50 years' time, this may be conventional. But this is, as I said, this is what was called cultured meat. This was grown in a lab. The hamburger on the left-hand side was eaten in London, was done in 2013. It cost about $350,000 to produce, which is expensive by anybody's standard, even for kosher meat. On the right-hand side, the steak, which was made a couple of years ago, was something like $10 a piece. So the price has gone down. The scientists are working very, very hard at it. And the question that fascinates us, that fascinates me, is this going to be kosher? Is this going to be something that we can have in our kitchens, in our supermarkets? And if we go back to our parasha, which tells us what the animals which we can eat, as we said, if this came from a cow, if it came from a chicken, it came from one of those animals which is in that list, which has those signs, does it follow all the rules? Is it going to be kosher? Is it going to be meaty? So let's begin, and let's begin our journey, and let's see where we get to. So first of all, in order to understand a little bit, I'm not going to get too technical in this, just to understand a little bit what we are talking about. What is this cultured meat? What is this lab-grown meat? However we want to talk about it. And I have two graphics here which I want to share with you. The first one is from 2013. The second one is from this year. And we'll see just a little bit how far this has come, how advanced this technology has gotten. As I said, when it was first made, 2013, we're talking about a hamburger which cost $350,000 to produce. In truth, it was a little bit of a publicity stunt. The way it was done back then, everybody realized this is not going to work on an industrial scale. This is not something that people are going to be buying in the supermarkets. It's not the way that it's going to be made, but it was to prove that it could be done. And the way that it was done was very simple, as follows. Over here, we have in this illustration a cow. And the amazing thing is that we're not talking about over here, we're not talking about soya, we're not talking about plant-based meat, we're not talking about meat substitutes, we started off with a real animal. Started off over here with a real cow. Some cells, a biopsy is taken from the cow, but the cow is still alive. There was no shchita involved. It did not, as the companies like to say, no animals were harmed in the making of the steak. That cow is still alive and probably doesn't even know what happened. A biopsy is taken, a number of cells, and these cells are microscopic. You cannot see them. They're taken, and in this particular case, these were muscle cells, but a certain type of muscle cells, stem cells, which are able to reproduce and multiply millions upon millions, perhaps billions of times. And eventually, all these cells are placed in some sort of a dish, in some sort of a liquid, which helps them to grow. Eventually, once they've divided, they've multiplied, there are enough of them, scientists are happy with, they switch the medium and they get them not to divide anymore, but to start to join together. They start joining together. They form, over here, what's called a myotube, a very thin, primitive sort of muscle fiber. Eventually, that fiber gets stronger, gets bigger. And over here, you can see the end result. In this case, as I said, this is what was done in 2013. You have a strip over here was cut in the middle, and you have a very, very thin strip of meat. They took a few 100,000 of those strips of meat, minced them together, added some salt and pepper, and over here you can see the result, and ultimately it was cooked. That's going back 8 years. Like I said, the way that it was done, a lot of advances have taken place in this technology. A lot of advances will still take place in this technology, but this is what we're looking at more or less today. Again, these cells coming from an animal, from a cow, which is still alive, and they're placed together. Rather than making hundreds of thousands of tiny little fibers, they're looking at ways to grow them so they make more of a 3D shape, more of a something which resembles a little bit more a burger or a steak or the things that we know, and you end up with your meal. As you can see over here, a picture of a cheeseburger. That's another one of the questions we want to know. Is it possible? Will a cheeseburger be kosher or not? And that's essentially what's being done, and that is this whole industry, which is really boomed over the last few years, what's called cultured meat or lab-based meat or cell-based meat, whatever you want to call it. The reason why this is being done, scientists are trying to perfect the world, trying to solve ecological problems, trying to solve animal welfare issues, trying to solve issues of hunger, that there may not just be with the rising global population, there may just not be enough meat for everybody, and maybe this is a way to satisfy our global hunger. So what does the Torah have to say about this? What does Halakha have to say about something so new, so novel, so cutting edge, so different to anything that we're used to? Do we have what to say about it? So the first thing that I think, and the first source that I want to look at together with you all today, is this Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin and Talmud Bavli, which maybe gives us a little bit of an insight as to why I spent the first part of the shir talking about the science behind it, talking about some of the technical details behind it. We had to learn about the Parasha. We had to learn about Torah. Why do we need to know the science that's involved? I think there's an amazing story. The Gemara over here tells us about Rav, one of the great sages. And Rav tells us the following. The context of this Gemara is discussing certain halachot when it comes to a firstborn animal, when it comes to if an animal has got certain blemishes, certain mumim, which may validate or invalidate it for parts of the sacrificial service or for other things as well. And there's a difference, I'm not getting technical at all here, this is not our subject today, but there's a difference between what's called a mum kavua and a mum over, a permanent blemish and a temporary blemish. And these would have different ramifications in terms of the halakha, how this animal is to be treated. And how would one know, looking at this animal, how would one know whether what they see is a temporary blemish or a permanent blemish? As I say, have different halachot associated with them. How would one be able to differentiate? So Rav, the great sage, says very easy. He says, the way I learned to differentiate, not very easy, but it's very simple to tell how he learned. He says, 18 chodashim gadalti etzel roeh be'ema. Says Rav, the great sage, I went for 18 months. I went for a year and a half. I left yeshiva and I went to live with the shepherd. I went to do apprenticeship. In order to know which blemish, what's considered a permanent blemish, what's considered a temporary blemish. You want to know about animals, you want to know about agriculture, you want to know about how it's done, you have to find out from the experts. And yes, ultimately, he's the Rav, he's going to be able to come along and paskin, he's going to come and give the answers, but he needed to know the scientific understanding behind it. And we have countless examples of this throughout the Talmud, throughout Halacha, where it comes to things. Yes, of course, the Torah has what to say about it, but we need to hear from the experts, whether it's medical, whether it's scientific, whether it's technological, whether it's agricultural, in all these different areas. We need to hear what the experts have to say. We need to hear what the reality is. Based on that, we can look at what are the principles that our Torah has given, what are the principles that we can extract from the Parasha, from the Talmud, from all of our sources, and see what they have to say about this once we have a bit of a deeper understanding. So we have a cursory understanding of what this lab-grown meat is. The next question, and it's a fascinating question that we can ask whenever there's a new technology, whenever there's a new question, something which is unprecedented. We all know that over hardly a day goes by when there is not some new technology in the world, things which were completely unprecedented, things which were unheard of before. And whilst we go back into the corpus of Jewish law, we go back thousands of years, where do we look? Where do we find the principles? Where do we find precedent for such a thing? Lab-grown meat, if you open up the Talmud, you won't find a discussion about lab-grown meat, I guarantee you that. But we do find something which is absolutely fascinating. It's absolutely remarkable. And just about every authority, just about every article that has begun discussing the subject, let's say it's right at the cutting edge. Until 8 years ago, it was completely science fiction. But just about everybody who discusses finds somewhat of a precedent. Somewhat of a precedent in the Talmud, again, going into Masechet Sanhedrin. And I'll call this the first type of unconventional meat. This was certainly not lab-grown meat into what we're talking about now, but this is meat in a very, very unconventional way. And the story goes as follows. The context of the Gemara, the context of the Talmud is that it tells us about Adam Rishon, the first man. In fact, the Gemara tells us that originally mankind was not given permission to eat meat. Only after the flood, after Noah, was mankind given permission by Hashem to go and to eat meat, to eat animals for food. But Adam Rishon was not given that permission. Yet at the same time, the Gemara actually says that Adam Rishon did eat meat. It says the Malachei Hasharet, the angels were feeding him meat and pouring him wine in Gan Eden. And the Gemara immediately recalls this, says, how can that be? That's a contradiction, and answers, well, actually, this was not ordinary meat. This was meat that fell from heaven. The Gemara calls basar hayored min hashamayim. And I'll just put the source up now in Hebrew together with the translation. And the Gemara tells us a fascinating story of Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta. After telling us that Adam Rishon would eat meat, but not the meat that you might think, but actually basar hayored min hashamayim, or we might call miracle meat, we might call meat that descends from heaven. The Gemara says, is there such a thing? Mi'ika basara yored min hashamayim. Really, is there such a thing as meat which just falls from the sky? We all know about the man which fell from the sky, but what about meat? And the Gemara says yes, there is, and tells us the following story. Kihad Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, one of the sages, he was walking along his way one day. And there were two lions which he encountered, which were roaring at him. What does one do when walking along and these lions were chasing after him? Seemingly they were hungry. He had to run away, and at the same time he davened. He said the following pasuk, and as he davened, as he did, his prayers were answered. Two thighs, two pieces of meat, two steaks fell from Shemayim. And what happened was, apparently the lions were not so hungry. Tells us the Gemara in the continuation, one of these steaks, one of these pieces of meat, which had just fallen from heaven, was eaten, was consumed. But the other one was left behind. So Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, after giving thanks, presumably, for his life which had been saved, he picked up the steak. He picked up this piece of meat and he went to the Beit Midrash. He went, he took it into the Beit Midrash and he turned to everybody. Perhaps he told them the story first, but then he said, he asked the following question. He said, this piece of meat, the steak which I am holding, is a piece of steak which fell from Shemayim. Is it kosher or is it not kosher? The answer that day in the Beit Midrash regarding that steak was unanimous. He said, non-kosher item does not fall from heaven. This must be kosher. This is a kosher piece of meat. It's a remarkable story. we look at this, and we have many stories like this in the Talmud. We look at them, and perhaps, for hundreds of years, whether these things, every story like this happened literally or didn't happen literally, sometimes they're hard to understand. Sometimes it's difficult for us to understand what is the message, what's coming out of it. What are Chazal trying to teach us when they included stories like this in the Talmud? What are we meant to derive from it? And perhaps for hundreds of years, people learned this Gemara and couldn't fathom how this could in any way, shape, or form happen in our everyday lives. Nowadays, although the parallel is not exact, yes, the analogy is not exact, we're not talking about meat which fell from the sky. And we're not talking about a miracle by any stretch of the imagination. We're talking about a scientific process. The way the science has evolved, sometimes it seems like miracles. But in the same way that in the story of the Gemara we had unconventional meat which was not grown in the normal way, meat that was not an animal which was slaughtered and then the meat was cut off, but rather something else which happened. Nowadays we have that something else, and who knows, perhaps in a few years, in a few decades, that might be what we think of as conventional meat. It might be. Again, science, technology has evolved to the point where we go back to our ancient sources and we look at things which seemed impossible to comprehend. Somehow they seem a little bit more possible. So how far does the analogy go? Does the analogy go, does this mean to say that any meat that's not grown in the normal way would necessarily be kosher? Does it mean it wouldn't require shechita? Does it mean that it would be considered meat? So a number of the authorities who've looked at this, who've discussed this, have questioned, maybe we have what to learn from this Gemara. Maybe this tells us that, in the same way that over there was kosher, in the same way our situation will be kosher. Probably the first scholarly article that was written in terms of the kashrut of the outgrown meat by somebody in Los Angeles by the name of Rabbi Tzvi Reisman. He wrote this in 2014, and he suggests that maybe we can learn from this that it would be necessarily kosher no matter what its source. Even if he goes so far as to say that perhaps even if it came from not one of the animals that has those signs that we saw in our parasha, but from anything else. Have a look at source number 6. He says stem cell meat created in a lab is not miraculous, as we've discussed. However, it's certainly not meat produced in the conventional way. It was true in 2014, it's true in 2021. Will it be true in another 20 years? I don't know. But it's not meat produced in the conventional way in which all animals were created. This is a new reality of creation, which came about through human intervention, and should be compared to meat, therefore, he says, created through Sefer Yetzirah, created through other miraculous means. And he says this would therefore be another reason to permit consumption of this meat, even if the original cell was taken from a non-kosher animal. I'll say right here and now, we're not going to paskin in the share today either. We're going to wait for that for final ruling on that. I'll say as well that this is very much a minority opinion. Most authorities and most rabbis do not think that it's so simple and so straightforward to say that if it came from a non-kosher animal, it would necessarily be kosher. But it's interesting to see the parallel that he takes. Most authorities are going to say that, yes, that source that we saw, as fascinating as it is not a direct analogy, and it's hard to learn something from it. Certainly it's hard to learn from there to say that, necessarily the animal would be kosher, even if it came from a non-kosher animal. Something, however, that perhaps we can learn from it, if we go back to that Gemara just for a moment. What was the question that Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta asked when he came to the Beit Midrash? He asked everybody, he said, Dvar Tameh or Dvar Torah? He said, I'm holding this piece of meat. I want to know, is it kosher or is it not kosher? Would it require shechita? Would it not require shechita? Something like that. But there's one question he didn't ask. He didn't ask the question, was it meat? Because it was obvious. It looked like meat. It tasted like meat. It was meat. It just had never been part of an animal. And this, based on this idea, says Rabbi Weiss, one of the foremost halachic authorities in the world today, in a response which he wrote a couple of years ago about this, he says, we can certainly learn from this Gemara. Maybe we can't learn, maybe it's not miracle meat. But in the same way that this was meat, it didn't just come necessarily from an animal, but it was clear and obvious and axiomatic to everybody that this was meat. It could not be parav. He says that would be the same with our current case as well. Let's have a look at the response which was written by Rabbi Weiss, source number 7. He says, in my humble opinion, it seems clear and obvious that anything that resembles, there's a typo over there, it says resembles eat should be meat. Anything that resembles meat in its substance, texture, and nature is meat. And there is no practical difference as to how it was created. This is not similar to other cases which are prevalent in the modern food industry, which we'll talk about in just a moment, where artificial flavorants are used, for these are permitted and not forbidden substances. He says this is not the case with this meat, which under any laboratory test would be identical to ordinary meat. Right? And what he's saying, and again, he proves it from that case in the Talmud, which we just saw, We're not talking about soy. We're not talking about plant-based, which, although it may taste like meat and may look like meat, but its molecular structure would not be this. Started from an animal, it is meat. And therefore, he says it's clear to me, it's axiomatic to me that whatever happens, it's going to be considered meat. We still haven't answered the question of whether it could come from a living animal. We still haven't answered the question of whether it could come from perhaps a non-kosher animal. And before we, again, as I said, I'm not going to give any conclusive rulings today, but we'll look at maybe some of the other questions that we could look at, some of the directions perhaps. I want to say this is not the first time that we've had such a case. Maybe this is an extreme example, something unprecedented. But there are many times, there are many things over the last few hundred years where, as we said, when we look in the Parasha, we look at what defines kosher animals, what defines kosher ingredients. It's pretty straightforward. But going fast forward, looking at even the last 200 years, source number 8 over here is from an article written by Roger Horowitz, a food historian in America, in an article entitled "The Real Thing: How Coke Became Kosher," talking about Coca-Cola. And he gives us a little bit of background. He says that processed food disrupted the stable categories on which kosher law was based through the inclusion of ingredients intended to make these products taste better, look attractive, and last longer. We have all sorts of ingredients today in food which could not have been imagined not that long ago. And he says the rigid categories prescribed by kosher law were no longer self-evident in modern food. Rabbi schools in pre-industrial Jewish law needed to figure out how to extend those principles to 20th century conditions. We all know today they needed not only to apply kosher law to contemporary food manufacturing, but also to ask American food manufacturers to accommodate kosher rules in the manufacturing process. And it's fascinating to look at, he tells the story of how Coca-Cola became kosher. And what happened, there was a Rav in Atlanta who had come from Europe, Rabbi Tuvia Geffen. He was approached by Coca-Cola to ask if their product would be kosher or not. And after looking at the ingredients, he realized that one of the ingredients was actually sourced, one of the molecules which they used was sourced from animal products. And it was questionable. It was questionable as to whether this could be considered kosher or not. Some authorities would have said yes, some authorities would have said no. And what he did was he went back to the company and he asked them, could they source it from a different place? Could they get plant-based products instead of animal-based for this particular ingredient which they were using? The company agreed, and that is how Coke became kosher. And it's fascinating. Going back to the beginning of the 20th century, these discussions were taking place between the food manufacturers, between the companies, and between the rabbis giving the stamp of approval. These discussions are still taking place today. When we talk about lab-based meat, many of the companies, some of the leading companies in the world that are doing this are in Israel. An article just was published this week talking about how Israel is a fake meat powerhouse. And yes, those self-same companies, once again, are talking to rabbis, are looking into what would be needed, perhaps, to change the manufacturing process, perhaps to make it kosher. So this is something which continues to this day. Very, very briefly, as I said, we can't give a full answer today, but what are just a couple of the issues that come up, whether this may be kosher or not? And I think it all boils down to, you can see in this graph in front of you, in source number 9, what's going to determine whether this product, this meat, at the end of the day is kosher or not, what's going to determine whether it's meat or not, is going to have a lot to do with those original cells, the original cells that come from an animal. And there are essentially 3 ways to look at them. I'm going to go from right to left in this. One way to look at them is if meat. They're being taken from the muscle of the animal. They're being taken from the cells of the animal. They've been taken from what would essentially become a piece of steak. Maybe they are meat, and maybe that's exactly what they are. And if that's the way one would look at it, then it would have to come from a kosher animal. It would have to come after shechita, and it would certainly be meaty. That's one way. That's the way that some authorities have ruled, and that's one direction. There is another direction that has been explored to say that perhaps we're not talking about meat, but the cells that come off the animal are derivatives. They're products from the animal. It's not meat itself. It's a cell which grows into meat. But we know that not everything that comes from an animal is necessarily meaty. Milk that comes from an animal is not meaty. Eggs that come from an animal are not meaty. Of course, they have to come from a kosher species of animal in the first place. So if we viewed it as derivatives, perhaps we might say it still needs to come from a kosher species, but perhaps it might be parov, perhaps it may not be meat itself. And thirdly, there are those who've suggested that perhaps the cells themselves are completely insignificant. They are microscopic. They are not edible in and of themselves as cells until they've gone through the process which they need to go through in the lab. And we have a principle where we say, Torah was not given to angels. Torah was given to us, to human beings. Things which cannot be identified with the human senses, in many instances, do not have importance in halacha. Classic case in point, we're talking about animals that we can eat or that we can't. If we think about microorganisms, we think about bacteria, we think about all sorts of creations which we can't see them. They're all around us, so we might be consuming them all the time. They don't have the split hooves or chew the cud that we spoke about at the beginning in our parasha. And the answer, which the poskim have been giving for the last 200 years, is that yes, those things which cannot be seen, those things which cannot be identified with the naked eye, but could only be seen with the help of a microscope, are going to be insignificant. The halachot and the rules and the laws of kosher and not kosher would not necessarily apply to them. So there have been those who suggested we start off with these cells. They're microscopic, they're insignificant, you can't see them. Eventually something comes out. Perhaps whatever it is, wherever it comes from, might be kosher. Again, I have to say that is, I think, to this point, a minority view. Many authorities come back and say, well, at the end of the day, it's hard to say they're insignificant when we are investing, when the world's investing so much, billions of dollars, the amount of time and effort. The scientists very much know that those cells are there because they're being manipulated in order to produce the meat. And certainly when one looks at that burger, that steak, or that meat at the end of the day, we can then tell and we can identify where it came from. So these are some of the questions. These are some of the things which are being explored based on the rules that come out in our parasha, based on the sources that we've seen in the Talmud, and based on others. This is a living conversation, as I said, which is taking place at the cutting edge of both halacha and science as well. One final point, just before we end off. Until now, we've been discussing the question of kashrut. We've been discussing the question of whether these things will be meaty, whether they'll be parov, whether they come from a kosher animal, a non-kosher animal, whether it'll be okay to eat them. But there's perhaps a more primary question, a more basic question we could ask, which is, what is our approach to such things? How does the Torah view it? How does Judaism view this? You might argue, you might say that this seems like unjustified, this seems like manipulation of the world. You might argue that this seems like playing God in a sense. We have meat, we know how meat grows on animals. Is this something that human beings are meant to be engaged in trying to go and take cells, create cell lines, grow them in a lab? It sounds a little bit strange, perhaps. And the answer, I think, to that is that, as we said at the beginning, this isn't just being done for fun. This is being done because there are ecological problems, because there are perhaps problems of hunger and starvation in the world, and these are being done. All of this research is being done in order to try and perfect the world, in order to try and improve things, in order to make life better for all of us across the globe. And that very, very much is part of what the Torah wants us to do and what the Torah requires of us. We have a quote here from Rabbi Soloveitchik in his work Halachic Man. He talks about why the Torah spoke about the creation of the world, without necessarily giving us all the cosmological secrets behind it, without giving us a physical description of the creation of the universe. But it was trying to teach us something else. And says Rav Soloveitchik, if the Torah spoke at length about the creation of the world and related to us the story of the making of heaven and earth and all their host, it did so not in order to reveal cosmogonic secrets and metaphysical mysteries, but rather in order to teach practical halacha. What's the practical halacha that comes out of this? The scriptural portion of the creation narrative is a legal portion, in which are to be found basic everlasting halachic principles, just like the portion of Kedoshim or Mishpatim or Shemini. If the Torah then chose to relate to man the tale of creation, we may clearly derive one law from this manner of procedure. The man is obliged to engage in creation and the renewal of the cosmos. Says Rav Soloveitchik, the Torah told us about the story of creation to teach us that we too are meant to be creative, that we too are meant to be partners in creation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And whatever way science, medicine, technology has brought us the tools, has given us the ability to help to perfect the world, certainly that's something which not only are we allowed to be engaged in, but which we're obliged to as well. So watch this space. I think sometime over the next few years, who knows when it's going to be, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but that meat is coming to a store near you. Will it be kosher? How will it be? Will it be meaty? We've seen some of the questions. We've seen some of the discussions that the poskim have begun to look at. So the answers will come very soon as well. Wishing you all a wonderful day and Shabbat Shalom.